Welcome to the first episode of Bookshelf, a new series produced by the Institute of South Asian Studies in Singapore, where we talk to authors about their books. Books about South Asia, a region stretching from Bangladesh to Afghanistan and deep into the Indian Ocean. We also focus on people from South Asia, wherever they live in the world. My name is Robin Jeffrey, and it's my great pleasure to be talking to Kama Maclean, a professor of history at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, about her latest book, British India, White Australia. Kama, welcome.
Thank you so much, Robin.
Kama, the book has an intriguing title. These two phrases are pretty familiar to historians and I think the general public. British India, White Australia. How did they get joined up? What's the book about and how did you come to write it?
The two are not often looked at in the same, framework. And I came to write it for a number of reasons. Obviously, I'm a South Asianist and I live in Australia, and I'm often involved in various sort of, Australia-India initiatives. And as someone who is often working in South Asian archives, whether it's in India or in London, I often find Australians coming across my desk in terms of, I see references to Australia. Not a lot, but enough to make me wonder if there was actually a deeper story there to tell. And so what I, over the years, sort of accumulated enough material to give me a sense that there's actually some really interesting synergies that happened between Australia and India before India's independence in 1947 that were perhaps worth looking at a little bit closer.
Yes, well, perhaps our viewers and our listeners aren't quite familiar with the power of that expression, White Australia. The British India part is probably fairly well known. It was a term often used to distinguish the old princely states from the areas the British ruled directly. But White Australia, it meant something to me as a Canadian in India 50 years ago. But what did it all imply, this term White Australia?
So White Australia was actually a policy, which was, in fact, it was even an informal name for an Immigration Restriction Act. And the bones of the act was, it was an act created upon Australia's federation to prevent the arrival of non-white migrants to Australia after 1901, after federation. And it had, over the years, the policy and the various means used to enforce it were known as White Australia. Now, interestingly, in India, White Australia is often talked about as though it's a place, as though Australia's name is actually White Australia, because it becomes so synonymous with, the continent in the course of the 20th century. And it's interesting, Australia was most widely known in India for the White Australia policy. And that's because many people wanted to migrate to Australia in the early 1900s, but there was actually a British policy which was endorsed and exhorted by Australians to let Indians know that they were not going to be able to land here. Now, the policy initially was aimed at trying to, it was always an economic argument put to the policy that it's simply a way of protecting white labour. But it was much larger than that. There were elements of racism that were injected into the administration of the policy, and that went into maintaining a lot of support for the policy. There was a very firm belief amongst politicians that it had widespread support in the population of Australia. There is some evidence to suggest that. There's often some to suggest the opposite as well.
Tell us about the Dictation Test. That was one of the more devious and absolutely infuriating aspects of the White Australia policy that was used as a device to keep out particularly Indian, especially Indian potential migrants. How did it work? And you have in your book, which is beautifully illustrated, a couple of examples of the exemption from Dictation Test that some of these poor chaps had to possess in order to return to Australia. Talk a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, so the British actually didn't really endorse the policy of immigration restriction because they liked to project the sense that there was equality throughout the empire, and that, you know, subjects of the empire, including Indians, could move throughout the empire unrestricted. Now, of course, in practice, it wasn't just Australia, but actually, you know, many of the other, what come to be known as white dominions, also enforced similar immigration restriction tests or legislation. And the means they use to administer the legislation is limited by Britain. Britain actually prevents the dominions from making overtly racist, like, you know, legislative and procedural you know, means of restricting immigration. So they have to find ways of managing these policies that are not explicitly racist, but actually are racist in operation only and not in name. And so the White Australia policy is one of the more famous ones. It actually gets its inspiration from Natal. And was encouraged, in fact, by the Secretary of State for the Colonies, Chamberlain, in 1901, said, look, you can actually use a language test as a way of testing for race. I mean, if in effect. So basically, if you require someone wanting to come to, in this case, Australia, to sit a language test, you can require them to sit any language test to demonstrate their proficiency in a language, and on the basis of that, exclude them. Now, for the Chinese population in Australia, of which there were substantial numbers even before 1900, many of them failed this outright because they didn't have English as a language. But many Indians, of course, had enough English to get a test, you know, to pass a test with. So the dictation test was eventually in Australia offered to people coming off ships in any unpredictable European language. And there's stories of one particularly proficient Indian linguist who is given the language in 3 different languages, European languages, before he eventually fails and is sent back home. So the language test was actually a mechanism to keep non-white labour out without explicitly using racist language.
Yes, yeah.
A specific exempting one from the dictation test was granted to those who lived in Australia before 1900 because it was admitted and conceded that they had rights, they had established rights of residency. And so they didn't have to set the test, but others did.
It is an absolutely Machiavellian way of doing it, to ask a person to perhaps sit the test in Latvian or a North or Finnish or a particularly obscure European language in order to block them in this way. So what was it like? We're talking about the period really after, between about the 1890s and 1947 in your book. What was it like being a person of Indian extraction in Australia at that time? What were people there for? What were they able to do?
Well, there were a large number of free settlers who came from India in the last decades of the 19th century. And many of them came looking for opportunities to work, looking to establish, you know, communities and be part of the greater sort of, you know, Indian diaspora, which is starting to disseminate throughout the empire at the time. And eventually, after the White Australia policy is enacted, I mean, the dictation test was just a means of preventing people from coming. There are a number of other legislative measures taken to make life rather difficult for those who already were living here. And so it was difficult for them, it was illegal for them to work in certain industries, in particular sugar, mining, hospitality. All of these were, again, reserved for white labour. And as a result, many Indians had to find forms of employment that didn't involve any of these sort of larger and more lucrative forms of work. Many of them ended up working as hawkers. So in fact, Australia's you know, first few decades after Federation, Australians, especially in rural areas, become heavily reliant on Indian hawkers who travel from town to town in rural areas selling their wares. And most of their wares actually come from India. So that was, I mean, the most Indian residents in Australia at that period did work as hawkers, and it was a difficult existence. You know, many of them lived, you know, on fairly marginal forms of existence. They were itinerant. They travelled constantly. They were unable to bring their wives and children to Australia because that was also precluded fairly early on. And although it was actually conceded eventually that they were allowed to bring their wives and children, the restrictions and the rules around that made it impractical or impossible. People weren't allowed to bring adult children, for example. So if a hawker was coming towards retirement and wanted to bring family out to run the business that he'd established, he was unable to do so because the child had to be a minor to come. So it was a fairly lonely existence for many Indian hawkers. Some married Australian women and settled and became actually quite prosperous, and others, lived here for as long as they could under the restrictions and the constraints that they faced. And, eventually either passed away, quietly in country towns, or some went back to India.
You've done some fascinating work talking to people in Australia who are descendants of some of these early traders and early migrants from India. We've got little towns in Australia like Renmark in South Australia and Woolgoolga in New South Wales with substantial populations descended from those times. Could you say a little bit about the sorts of people you've met in that kind of inquiry for your book?
It's interesting. There are amateur historians who are doing a lot more in this space than I am. I didn't actually conduct a lot of oral history because the period that I was really focused on, there's really not very many people around from that time. Some of their families are. And really, I came in contact with these people simply by accident. I'd get into a taxi and the driver would be the president of the Australia-India Association, who was dedicated to the task of sort of uncovering these stories, and told me that they had an uncle that came to Australia. His name was Indian Charlie, and did I know anything about him? And sometimes I'd get emails from people who were looking for evidence of their, great-grandfathers in Australia. So I don't have actually a huge amount in that particular area. I think there's a lot of more community-based historians that know more than I did about that. But there's certainly interesting stories that I found through white Australians who remembered stories of, Indian hawkers that touched their families' lives. And, these stories had sort of passed on through generations. So there was a librarian I used to work with at UNSW who remembered her family had a regular hawker whose name was Ludda Budda Dean, and he had all of these interesting sayings. He used to play cards, he used to like to win at cards, and he had some sayings that he taught the family, which they still use to this day. Even though she herself didn't remember Ludda, she knew the stories and some of his turns of phrase that had gone on to inform family law.
Your book, it's one of the attractions of your book. You've got a couple of wonderful photographs of these men with their carts and with people gathered around them, trading with them, in effect. It's a grand aspect to the story, I think. But Kama, most of this book is, your book is about a period when the Indian national movement is on fire in India under the influence of Gandhi and the Congress Party, and that kind of stirring period of Indian history in many ways. But what did Australians know about the Indian national movement in this period of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s that you're concerned with in the book?
So it's an interesting thing. They know very little at the beginning, and practically nothing that isn't through British hands. And so this is the sort of dynamic I'm looking to explore in the book. I mentioned earlier that the British didn't approve of Australian immigration restriction because it was racist. And yet Australian legislators, when they were confronted with this, they said, but actually everything you're doing in India is just as problematic. They didn't use the term racist, but they said you discriminate against Indians too. That's why you're in India after all. And so there was this interesting sort of dynamic where the British would complain about Australian racism and Australians would just point back, well, the whole reason why you're colonizing India is in fact for all of the reasons why we are preventing Indians from coming to Australia. So there was an impasse around this. And this interesting sort of colonial dynamic is what I was trying to draw out. Now, Australia was obviously a colony in the empire, but it was self-governing from, relatively early on compared to India. And it's quite interesting. All of our information about India comes through imperial hands, whether it's through Kipling in novels or in any other form of colonial knowledge, through newspapers. We're entirely dependent upon British information to understand India. And as a result, we imbibe British understandings of Gandhi, and usually very unsympathetic ones. So in the 1920s in particular, when the first sort of round of the non-cooperation movement takes off, Australians are quite unsympathetic to Gandhi and any idea of Indian independence, because it's breaking the empire. And we see it very much like that, just fought a world war, of course, on the British side, and no one's really ready to see the empire collapse just yet. But the story, if you like, of the 1930s and the 1940s is of Australians starting to get independent access to information about India through Indian experience directly, through which we start to develop a more nuanced understanding of why Indians want to get out of the empire, what Gandhi's narrative actually is, and why Indian independence can be understood within its own terms and not through the lens of the British.
Well, in that case, Kama, what does your research tell us about the international relations between Australia and India since 1947? As you and I both know, and I think most of our colleagues in both our institutions know, when India and Australian politicians get together, they talk about cricket. They say, well, isn't it nice that so many of us speak English? And they talk about the Westminster system of democracy that we all have. And on the strength of those, we should be getting along famously. But that's not necessarily the case. There's always that notion that something is missing in the relationship. Does your research fill in any of those missing gaps, do you think?
Look, I hope so. I indicate very early on why I think cricket is actually is far too competitive a genre to be applied to international relations. Yeah. The operations of the Westminster system are increasingly coming under threat. But more importantly, I don't think Australians have, in making the illusion that, we're both Commonwealth countries, therefore we must have something in common. I think that, it's a very glib way of looking at Indian history and the Indian experience of British rule. Now, Australia too has, strong currents of anti-imperialism here and there, but by and large, we Australians, saw themselves in the period that I'm looking at as being part of the white man's burden, in fact. And Australian, especially from the early 1900s, there was some very strong lobbying in Australia to take part in getting Australians into the Indian administrative services, for example, in order to take part in imperialism. Now, they never were terribly successful in doing that. There were a couple who got in, but not very many. But really, Australia has also had a very imperial framework, partly as a result of being dependent on imperial information to understand India, that I don't think, contemporary attempts to form relations with India takes into consideration. I think we need to bear in mind that India was trying to get out of the empire, and therefore talking about, these wonderful commonalities we have is really not going to convince anyone.
Kama, we're getting near the end of our time, but what's your next project? You've written, your first book was on the Mahakumbh Mela at Prayag or Allahabad, a history of that. Your second was on Indian terrorists. You've now written a book on the Australia-India historical relationship. What's next?
I know these all seem like they're unconnected, but I think the theme that connects all of these books is communication. And whether it's social communication through the mechanism of pilgrimage, or communication through the very astute use of visual imagery and media in the 1930s, or the ways in which ideas about India are communicated in Australia. I think that's been my link throughout. And so my next project is to actually look at the role of sound in Indian political communication during the 1930s. Sound.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, sound studies is a growing subfield. it hasn't really come to the understanding of South Asian history in any big way yet. And so I'm hoping to, and I've already begun to look for sounds in the archives, broadly speaking. So the lyrics of songs, I think everyone, you know, we've always used those as historians, but I'm really looking for the noise around speeches. You know, Indian nationalism was very noisy, and I mean, really, it's a miracle at all that anyone could get a word in, least of all Gandhi, given the sort of feebleness of his voice. And so I want to look at some of the ways in which, mechanization, uses of microphones, management of who gets access to microphones, are used to communicate ideas of nationalism in the 1930s.
Ah, well, I'll await that one with great eagerness. Kama, it's been very good to talk to you, a real delight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. Always great to talk to you too.
You've been with Kama Maclean of the University of New South Wales discussing her latest book, British India, White Australia, published by the University of New South Wales Press. I'm Robin Jeffrey, and this has been Bookshelf from the Institute of South Asian Studies in Singapore. We hope you'll join us for future bookshelf discussions with authors from around the world. But for now, goodbye.